But I said to him, I go, dude, that's the one that's going to get you stabbed.
Really?
Yes. And he used to talk about it on stage, saying, Joe Rogan always says that's the one that's going to get me stabbed. Like,
wow.
Which is so crazy. It's not Tony's wheelhouse, man. Tony's just talking shit about people's clothes and stuff. Like, he's very shallow with that. Like, his comedy is all just, you're a loser. You know, but it's fun. It's like, and he'll get through it. He's going through a storm.
So last week, we made a video talking about Tony's massive ego during a recent appearance on Duncan Trussell's podcast. And on that video, we mentioned how his close relationship with Joe Rogan and the fact that he is a Rogan Sphere comedian have given him this false sense of security and delusion that is common with Rogan Sphere comedians. And funny enough, we posted that video on Saturday, which was a day before his controversial appearance at the Trump rally. And it turned out to be great timing because this isn't about politics. To me, what I thought was a lot more interesting was how this could be a massive blow to Tony's ego and potentially harm his reputation as being one of the best comedians or one of the best roasters in comedy. And since now we do have different reactions from different comedians, including Joe Rogan himself, who said some things that actually surprised me, because even though he was obviously defending Tony, which I agree with, what stood out to me was basically Joe Rogan admitting to warning Tony that it wasn't a good idea to do the jokes or the gig in the first place.
Don Rickles was almost like, he was in this category of ultra famous comedian, right? He was in this Dave Chappelle type category where just seeing Don Rickles, all of a sudden it was a comedy show. Like, oh my God, Don Rickles is here. Tony Hinchcliffe does not have that, right? If Dave Chappelle went up and did 10 minutes in front of Donald Trump or 10 minutes in front of Kamala Harris, that's a different thing. Because it's like he's a cultural icon, and you immediately go into stand-up comedy mode. Like, oh, Chappelle's here, right? That's what Don Rickles had with Reagan. Tony doesn't have that. It's a bad thing to do. The whole thing's bad.
But he also basically said that Tony is not that good or big enough of a star to get away with performing edgy comedy at a rally, which is really wild because it shows that even Tony's biggest backer, Joe, wasn't fully on board and didn't think he had the skills to get away with doing that set, which once again could be a serious blow to his ego. So it's not so much about the jokes not landing, Tony doing lazy comedy, or people getting offended at jokes. It's the fact that he went from being on top of the world after doing the roast of Tom Brady and basically being one of the highlights to now showing everyone that without a massive machine like Netflix or a group of writers, he's really not that guy and shouldn't be comparing himself to late night television and instead stick to telling people how much they suck and doing edgy comedy.
People always used to say to us when we started trigonometry, they were like, the whole free speech thing is bullshit, blah, blah, blah. You just want to be able to say racist things. You're right. And they were right. And they were and that's why I came to Texas.
Whoever booked him is shitting their pants right now.
Why did you do that? I tell all comedians, don't ever do comedy at something that's not a comedy event. Don't do it. Don't ever do comedy at a place that's doing also. Doing, is it gonna have a bunch of speakers and you're gonna go up and do 10 minutes? Don't ever do that. It's a terrible setup. It's a terrible setup, and it's a political rally, and you're doing jokes like you're in a comedy club. It doesn't. You can't. Don't do it.
I don't really blame Tony, though, because Tony is what Tony is, right? Like, if you want an insult comic, Tony is the best in the world.
That's literally his great specialty is roasting.
Right.
So he's the best roaster ever.
If you book Tony Hinchcliffe is going to be Tony Hinchcliffe.
Exactly.
So whoever booked him, that's the person that's made the mistake.
Not just booked him, but apparently went over his material.
Did they go over his material?
No.
Oh, my.
This is what I've read on the internet, so it must be true. I got to tell you, that joke kills at comedy clubs. I don't like the joke. It kills. And I said to him, it's just like, if you're Puerto Rican and you hear that in the audience, like, oh, but it's a funny joke. The joke does well.
Now, when it comes to Joe Rogan, it is really interesting because he was one of the few, if not the only comedian that actually gave his honest opinion on Tony's joke, his performance, and how he felt about the whole thing. Because all the comedians and the people that knew Tony came out and basically said that Tony was just doing his job, that the jokes were not that bad, and that Tony was just doing what Tony does. And I actually agree with that. I'm not a fan of cancel culture culture, especially not over a joke, regardless of how bad it is. And to be fair, he did have some decent material, but for Tony Hinchcliffe standards at a massive event like that, you know, they were complete trash. But also for the past 6 months, he has been talking about the roast of Tom Brady, like if it was about him or like if he carried the whole thing, which is not the case. But also he has been comparing Kill Tony to late night television and talking about how much bigger and better it is. And so if he wants to take all the credit for that, then he also has to take the heat for not doing well at an event as big as the rally. But also keep in mind that back when that happened, Tony went on Two Bears One Cave and was brutally honest to both Tom and Bert Kreischer about their performance. And now looking back, even though, yes, it was great entertainment, you could argue that Tony was being extremely rude. And so now it would be funny if both Tom and Bert Kreischer made fun of Tony for what happened. And by the way, don't forget to like the video. It helps out so much and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Sent them a script. They send their script, like their punch-up script. Right. Combine the two.
Yeah, you're like, that's good enough.
Kind of.
That's great.
I'll tell you what.
No reason to work on this anymore. It's just the most watched thing ever.
First and foremost, all you should be saying is thank you, Bert and Tom. Because without us, it is a bunch of people doing the exact same thing.
Right.
Like we broke up. We definitely.
Yeah,
thank you
it was
to Kim Kardashian.
It was a comedy up until you guys started. Then you guys got to really change the tone a bit. You had to make everybody appreciative of laughter.
I had no idea. I told him this.
I'm still living in oblivion. I had a blast. I think we did great. I've not met one person that did not like what we did.
Guys,
people hate you.
I know it's not as easy. I know. Not all of us are darlings like you, chubby-headed. Anyway, so
we should tell you our story. I think it'll really frustrate you.
I think you hate our story.
Oh, well.
No, I'll tell you when we're done. I'll tell you
if it's anything like the set, I probably would hate it. No, I'm kidding. Yeah. You guys phoned it in like an Israeli airstrike. I'm joking. Anyway.
And look, when I first saw on Sunday morning that Tony would be at the rally, I didn't think much of it. I just assumed that he would go up there and speak, maybe do a few jokes, but mainly just endorse Trump, which if you have seen the show for the past year, it's not a surprise. But then to find out that he actually did a full comedy set and technically bombed, that's when things get really interesting because we're talking about Tony Hinchcliffe, the guy from the roast of Tom Brady and the host of one of the biggest comedy shows in the world. So you would think that somebody with that much experience could be able to adjust and, read the room. And so I don't fully agree with the take that he was just doing his job because that would be like saying that if a firefighter who was only used to putting out small fires then goes on to a big fire at a building, sprays a little bit of water and goes, hey, I did my job. That usually works over there, so it's not my fault if it didn't work here. I mean, that would be insane. And even though he did get a ton of exposure, it was a massive opportunity and he dropped the ball. No matter how you spin it, this was a big L for Tony. He may have gained some fans, but it wasn't for the right reasons like it was at the roast. So the question is, did he have writers this time or was he just not prepared? Because I also have to disagree with Joe when it comes to rallies not being the place for comedy. I think we can all agree that Trump himself uses a ton of humor and it's worked for him. So for Tony, that wrong place excuse doesn't really work. The place was fine. He just didn't deliver.
He made a joke,
yeah,
right?
exactly. He made a joke.
There's an island of trash.
Yeah.
It's called Puerto Rico. Here's where that joke comes from. Tony is actually obsessed with the Pacific garbage patch and like the fact that we just throw, like we were talking about like recycling. Like recycling doesn't work. They don't do it. Most of your bottles when you throw in a recycler, they get put in landfills. So there's a landfill in Puerto Rico that's way overflowed. Puerto Rico has a legitimate trash problem. Because they're on an island. Like, where are you going to put it, right? There's all these people living on that island. Where are you going to put it? And so they have landfills. Their landfills are way over capacity. So that's where the joke came from.
Right.
Like, the joke came from, like, Tony being environmentally conscious about recycling.
Yeah, they don't seem to have taken it that way.
But from his roaster perspective, that's where the joke comes from.
Totally.
I think it's called Puerto Rico. And you say it and everybody laughs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, we were at the rally. And people say no one laughed. Not quite true. Like, it didn't get a big laugh, but it you got a bit of a laugh.
It's a funny joke.
Yeah.
It's, even Jon Stewart said it was a funny joke, which I thought was great of him.
He had much better ones that got a bigger response, but yeah.
It's a terrible, people are like, well, it wasn't funny. Right. Because it was a terrible setup for comedy. Everything was wrong. If you were at a comedy club and the guy did that set, you'd be laughing. It's just a bad setup. Everything's wrong. It's like...
Now, here's the thing. If Joe Rogan has to jump in to explain your joke, you're already in deep trouble because it doesn't matter what the backstory or where the joke came from. It was lazy comedy. Again, he did have some pretty good jokes, but overall, for Tony's stand-up comedy, it was bad. I mean, he himself has said in the past that there's a difference between Tony the host and Tony the stand-up comedian. And I agree to an extent. I've seen him live, and even though his stand-up comedy isn't the most thought-provoking comedy or well-written jokes, it is funny, and that is the purpose of comedy at the end of the day. But then when I saw his performance at the roast of Tom Brady, I was actually impressed, and I thought he had improved a lot, and the jokes were a lot better. But now looking back, there is a chance that maybe he just had better writers back then. And this really highlights something that we covered on the last video when comparing Kill Tony to late night television, which is that the reason why Kill Tony will potentially never be bigger or more popular than late night TV is that late night comedy has that structure and system in place to prevent weak material like this from making it to air. Now, I'm pretty sure they have their own problems behind the scenes, but they do manage to put out content regularly that can still touch on political and controversial topics. This is because they likely have a process for quality control, whereas with the Rogan Sphere comedians, they surround themselves by yes men, and when it comes to Tony, he doesn't even take advice from the one person they all consider their leader, Joe Rogan.
It's just a bad environment. It's a bad environment for comedy. And, that joke, I would have told him, don't you dare do that joke. I never, sat down with him. I didn't know what bits he was going to do. But then I heard he did that joke. I was like, oh, Jesus, Tony. Here it comes.
I think there are comedians probably who... I think Tony's the wrong type of comedian for that environment. If you had someone 100%. Come in who wasn't a roast comedian, who actually made everyone feel good and
who
clean...
Who could do it and just talk about cultural issues and get everybody to laugh is Jimmy Dore. Jimmy Dore is really good at that. He could do something like that because he's so knowledgeable when it comes to politics. He could bridge the gaps between humor and fact and reality and what we're up against. He could do that. But it's not Tony's wheelhouse, man. Tony's just talking shit about people's clothes and stuff. He's very shallow with that. His comedy is all just, you're a loser. But it's fun. It's and he'll get through it. He's going through a storm, and that's what happens with all these things with people like that. But it's good for him, too. When he got canceled in the past, he came back way stronger as a comic because he felt like he had to prove something. It made him really tighten up his material, really edit things well and really, write sharp stuff. That's what'll happen with him. He'll come back better.
And this is when things get wild because in that last clip, Joe Rogan circles back to the idea of how the rally isn't the best environment for Tony's comedy. But then he takes it a step further and actually admits that Tony himself isn't the right one for the gig. And Joe does have a good point that Tony's comedy style works for light, silly comedy, like telling people that they suck or roasting, but it's not suited for anything political or serious. And he even mentions other comedians like Jimmy Dore, who he thinks would be able to handle that environment because, they're actually informed on those topics, and basically calling Tony's comedy shallow. And look, in the past, we have mentioned how even though Kill Tony is massively successful and it is a good show, it is overrated in my opinion. And also, Joe Rogan described it perfectly because Tony's humor doesn't really dive into complex or thought-provoking topics, and instead it's more focused on quick, surface-level laughs and roast-style insults and shock value.
And now he's finally getting his confidence. That was okay, that's what you want. That is Tony actually getting his confidence right now. Which that joke to me is really, really funny. But if I had to guess, I would say that Tony actually didn't write that joke. If I had to guess, I would say that a very funny comedian by the name of probably wrote that joke and sold it to Tony. But like I said, that joke does not feel like Tony's writing. I've known Tony forever, and no matter what Tony tells you, Tony was never one of the comedians that would perform outside of the Comedy Store. If somebody took him on the road, then he would perform outside of the Comedy Store. But I performed all over LA. I would do every open mic, every show, every comedy club, and I never saw Tony outside of the Comedy Store, and Tony really wasn't outside of the Comedy Store. It's like Tony wanted too much to be Tony, and he's always calling himself a roast comic, and he compares himself to Don Rickles. But Don Rickles, I'm a true Don Rickles fan, have been forever. And so a lot of Don Rickles jokes were like he would deliver them like they were throwaways, where Tony will deliver a joke and act like, yeah, I said it. But a lot of the jokes that he says just aren't strong enough to meet the challenge that his personality is responding to or defending.
Now, when it comes to the massive backlash and Tony going forward, I don't think this will affect him at all, and I don't think it should. Again, it was simply just a bad joke. But in terms of his ego, there's no way this isn't a massive blow to his ego and to his confidence, because to hear people like Joe Rogan, comedians like Joe Rogan, saying the things that he said, you know, that is pretty wild. But also, to be fair, back then when Tom and Bert Kreischer had their horrible performance at the roast of Tom Brady, everyone, including us here, made fun of them for how they performed, even though technically they didn't bomb and it was an okay set in terms of them getting laughs and doing some okay jokes. But because on paper they were the biggest comedians at the time and still kind of are, you know, it was a massive disappointment and a good opportunity to make fun of them. And same thing with Tony's sets. It's not political. If he would have destroyed and gotten a standing ovation, you know, none of this would have happened. But who knows? Maybe that was the plan the whole time. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. Dislike if you didn't like the video. But that is all we have for today. See ya.